Hey there, I'm just going to try to put something together that I usually go through with my students to talk about Beowulf before we read it. So here we go. All right, so basically before Beowulf, before 449 AD, we can think of, the advanced places in the world as places like Greece with their philosophers, Alexander the Great, Aristotle, Egypt, the pyramids, their great libraries and scholars, their ability to create the um, pyramids with their engineering and mathematics and astronomy and all of that. And then also there's Rome, right? The great cities you can think of, the buildings they could construct, um, the Colosseum, places like that, the Leaning Tower you might think of. And they had, great um, politicians, law, and government, and armies, and things like that. Uh, Meanwhile, Europe was in this deep, dark place. If we think of Central Europe as sort of like France and Germany, Great Britain, it's full of like savages, people that are not educated and still sort of stuck in a pre um, Grecian or Roman kind of technological advancement, if you will. Um, Although there are things like Stonehenge. Some thought that the Druids might have constructed that. They're not really sure who did. Um, but so we've got sort of Europe coming out of the Dark Ages. That's what I think of, and that's where Beowulf kind of emerges. Just a picture of Stonehenge because it sort of, I think, presents that imagery of what the sort of Central Europeans were coming out of. Another thing that I think connects with this, I have this slide here from Thomas Hobbes because his philosophy kind of highlights where those people were coming from, right? He had a deeply pessimistic view of human nature, um, thinking basically that man was kind of this violent and brutish person. And that's kind of where I sort of see Beowulf fit in. In any event, the story of Beowulf, it actually takes place around Denmark and Sweden. So we have these people, the Jutes, before Beowulf's time, or just around Beowulf's time, start to migrate over to the British Isles, the Angles moving in, the Saxons moving in, and that's where our language sort of grows out of, is these people that migrate to the British Isles, their languages meld, and English grows out of that. Somewhere in all of this, the Jutes just kind of get lost. Around 449, Germanic tribes arrived in England, right? These are the Jutes, Anglo-Saxons, displaced the native British Celtic population, and Anglo-Saxon arises. So Beowulf is important because it is, one of the first written pieces that we have in our language. Although the story was passed on orally, wasn't written down until somewhere between the 8th and 10th century. So somewhere between, 780 and 900 something, but they don't really know exactly when the story was written down. It was composed in Anglo-Saxon, which really for us is like a foreign language or something. And it was spoken from about 400 to 1100. And this period of literature is called the period of Old English, because that's what was spoken at the time. So it's the earliest form of the language that we use today. We don't really know who the poet is or was. It was passed on orally, and then at some point it was written down. Um, but it's considered to contain elements of both pagan religion and Christianity. So something to look for is the mixes of those two elements in the story as you're reading it. Um, right. So Beowulf is among the first vernacular, spoken everyday language that we have in English. It was lost for a long period of time and then found again, but it didn't really become popular or thought of as this greater piece of literature until J.R.R. Tolkien wrote this piece called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. And he's the first to assert that the poem was really important for us and our culture. And it served as the basis for Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So if you've read or know those stories or movies even, there are a lot of elements in them where he borrowed from Beowulf. And just something that could, tell us about sort of the the connection we might have if you know with an average audience of 30 million viewers per week, what was the number one scripted show on television. If you said Game of Thrones, then that's the kind of, maybe we could think of that popularity probably at its time, in the 500s and 600s. Maybe this story had that kind of like appeal for the people that were hearing it at the time. um, just a little bit about paganism, right? Here's where it comes from: Latin paganus, meaning villager or rustic. So it's really taken on kind of a negative connotation, um, being associated with heathen, right? So someone that's a non-Christian, but it's a polytheistic, nature worshiping kind of religion. So sometimes I liken it to something like the Shinto religion of Japan, which is also sees, God or divine things in the rocks or the river, the mountain, the ocean. Those kinds of things are what they worship. So it's similar, in that way. Do you know any pagan holidays? Um, you might think of Halloween, or Christmas is even partly pagan, with the Christmas tree having elements of that. Um, Valentine's Day, our celebration of the solstices and equinoxes, are also tie in with that. So, many of the things that we celebrate now, throughout the year, um, have a deep rooted connection to these pagan ideals that predate, when Christianity coming in and taking over, or dominating our culture and societies. The story of Beowulf is really pretty simple. Um, and so it's basically an epic, hero's story, right? Beowulf's this guy from Sweden. He's a Geat or a Yayat, um, and that just means a Swede. He's going from Denmark to fulfill his weird or his fate. And what's that? What is this weird? It's fate. It literally means it's like blind force or fate. And he's going there to save the Danes and their king Hrothgar from a man-eating monster, Grendel. Um, so it's really a pretty straightforward story. The version that we are reading is the full story. There are multiple translations of this story by different authors. Um, In our purple textbook, there's a different translation, which is just contains the three main battles that occur in the story. So it's cut down. Reading the full story, there are a number of different transgressions that are harder to figure out what's going on, and a lot of that is largely because of figuring out who is a Swede and who is a Dane, and the names are also tough to get, names like Hrothgar and so forth. As you read, some of these come from our book. I think that's where I got them. Just names of that they have meaning. Edgethou, Beowulf's father, means like sword servant. Hrothgar means glory spear. Herit means hall of the heart. So the names had some kind of meaning attached to them like that. There are a number of concepts that come from this era. So pagan, already mentioned that. Comitatus, comradeship was really important. Weird, this blind force was important. The concept of weregeld literally means man price. So it's, the idea of sort of loyalty to someone, and in return for that loyalty, um, the person would get payment of some sort. But it's also associated with like blood feuds or bloodlust. So kind of like um, one clan attacks another clan, and then the other clan either has to be compensated with money or be allowed to take the life of someone from the other clan in order to even things out. Loth, the combination of boasting and heroic actions to gain fame and make one's reputation gain renown. Um, so these were all, concepts that were prevalent during Beowulf's time, that come through in the story. Right, glory is really important. So one thing I could say is that probably we could link a lot of these ideas with with the president that we have right now, or in terms of things that he desires. Thanes, it's another word that comes up. They're just warriors. These are the people who would be willing to give their lives for their master or the person that they follow. So you could think of them as sort of like the Marines. They often swore their allegiance to their leader or their king, and the king would give them a ring or something to show that connection. Some of the important characters obviously Beowulf, he's the main character. Hrothgar, he is a Danish king. Wealhtheow, women in the story are not so prevalent, but we can still glean, or there's a lot to be understood from the story, even though they're not so predominant in the story, or they're minor. But there's still a lot that we can learn from the story about women, maybe in that time frame. Grendel, this is the man-eating monster. Edgethou, this is Beowulf's father. Wiglaf, this is Beowulf's kind of sidekick.
So, important poetic terminology that we might talk about would be first epic, means words put to song. That's where it comes from, the etymology of it. It's a long narrative poem, story told in a poetic way or a poetic form. So it uses rhythm, alliteration, caesura, stuff like that. Epic hero, right? This comes up in Beowulf. He is the central figure in this long story that complex society, and we can hope to gain some understanding, more understanding about how they lived and what people were like and what their times were like. The poem is constructed in half lines containing caesura, so that caesura is just a pause, so it's one line of poetry, and in the middle there's like a short break, and that's usually represented by a comma or just a space or a semicolon. And so if you look in your Beowulf textbook, on the left page of the poem, you get the old Anglo-Saxon, but it just looks like gobbledygook. You can't read any of it. On the right side, you get Seamus Heaney's translation. So the book is about 200 pages or so, but it's really only 100 pages, so it's really kind of a short story. This is the first page of the sole surviving manuscript. And just to see what that looks like, how it was written down back around, who knows, 800 AD or 900 AD or something like that. But if you look, you can kind of make out some of the letters. You might think this looks sort of like an H, but it's actually, this is for the sound for, it is H, like what. If you think of words like wheat thins or why, when, we sort of pronounce those WH words with an H sound in the beginning sometimes. First word is what, which is here means like look, listen, hey. It's just an attention grabber, not a question. I've got this great story to tell you here. Anyway, it looks kind of like that. So here are the first lines in our book. What way Gardena in Gerdegum. I can't speak Old English, but it's something like that. So the spear days and days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. You've heard these lines. These princes, hero campaigns, something like that. That's so. If you look at the Old English text, you can see the caesura runs down the middle. You can see the break. So, in some ways, Seamus Heaney is trying to keep his poem in sync with Old English in a really close way.
Okay, this text is a piece from Old English. It looks like we might be able to read some of it, but it's not completely modern English. Let's listen to this a couple of times just to see what Old English sounded like when Beowulf was orally told.
Fadde ora, thwth ei out on herfanum, sithi nama yahalgot. Toba kuna thina richa. Ye wortha thin willa on ei orthan swa on herfanum. Oran ye dagwam likan chlaf siula usta dag. And for yifus ura yiltas, swa way for yifath ura yiltendum. And the yeled thu us on kostnumia, akalusas of urilla, sooth licha.
Let's listen again.
Fadde ura, thwth ei out on herfanum, sithi nama yahalgot. Toba kuna thina richa. Ye wortha thin willa on ei orthan swa on herfanum. Oran ye dagwam likan chlaf siula usta dag. And for yifus ura yiltas, swa way for yifath ura yiltendum. And the yeled thu us on kostnumia, akalusas of urilla, sooth licha.
So we should be able to make out some of the words. For example, this looks almost like father, earth, nama, name. So we can make out some words that are, modern to today. Probably the most interesting word or words to listen to are swa swa. Some of you may have guessed this is right, the modern or we're hearing Our Father, or the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's what we were listening to. Here, I'm just giving you a number of different authors and the beginning words of their translation of Beowulf. Right, J.R.R. Tolkien starts off with, "Lo, the glory of the kings of the people of the Spear Danes." Burton Raffel, he's in our purple text. "Hear me, we've heard of Danish heroes, ancient kings, and the glory they cut for themselves." Here's another. "Attend, we have heard of the thriving of the throne of Denmark, how the folk kings flourished in former days." And Seamus Heaney, "So, the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness." I don't know about you, but just for me, sometimes it's interesting just to see what words they chose or how they differed in their translations. Some things for us to think about as we're reading this is the poem Christian or pagan? What can we learn or understand about Anglo-Saxon society and women and how they lived during that time or at that time? Is the poem primitive? Is it sophisticated? What leads you to think those, which one it is, or that idea? Is the poem ironic in any way? Maybe one of the bigger things to think about, what's the point of the poem's stress on doom, foreboding, and death? Some literary terms that are used throughout this poem are, well, it is an epic. It's an example of that. A lyric, right? A short poem. The word lyrics for music comes from this. Kenning, this is a descriptive phrase, or it's a compound word. It's substitutes for a noun. So an example would be whale road, which means like the road in the sea or sea path or something like that. Stock epithet is a similar kind of replacement describer for a character. So if we called, rather than calling Jim as a fast runner, if we named him the swift-footed. Alliteration, I think you all know what this means. Consonants at the beginning of words. So something like, she sells seashells by the seashore. All of the S and SH sounds at the beginning of words in that tongue twister. Caesura, this, I already explained this, but it's a space that divides a line into two, usually uses a comma, a semicolon, or simply a space to show a gap. And allusion, something to look for in the story. There are lots of, well, the easy allusions that come up are the biblical ones, but looking for other kinds of allusions could be good in the story.